All right, it looks like our influx of participants is slowing down a little bit. I'm sure we'll have more people come in the next few minutes. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. This is a webinar hosted by the MAA Graduate Student Council. We are a council of graduate students who sits um, over the body of MAA members who are graduate students. And I am the co-chair, Rebekkah Hart, at least for another week, along with Camilla Marcone and Mathilde Montpetit. Novella Fraser will soon be taking over as the new chair next year. And that will be happening at Kalamazoo. At Kalamazoo, for those of you who will be in person, there will be a graduate student happy hour, probably the first night of Kalamazoo. So please do keep an eye open for announcements about that event. It will happen. The announcements will go out on our socials as well through email. But there will be food and drinks and lots of good times. So please make an effort if you're there. For our other programming, we are going to have some more webinars in the next couple of months, details to follow. So keep an eye out on your emails and we'll get those details to you soon. So for now, let's go ahead and introduce our speaker today. We are focusing on applying for MAA grants today, and we have a very special speaker, Dell, who received his PhD at the Catholic University of America last year, writing a dissertation on late Carolingian politics. He is the Special Projects Assistant at the MAA, where he works on a variety of tasks, including grant opportunities like he's doing for us today, and coordinating the MAA's database of medieval digital resources. John, take it away.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'm assuming, hopefully the sound is working. So yeah, I'm John. I got my PhD last year, and I've been the special projects assistant at the Medieval Academy for a bit over 2 years. And because I was a grad student until very, very recently, I understand how sort of tough the world is trying to piece together funding for conferences and research trips. And one of the things I wanted to do was sort of spread the word about the opportunities here at the Medieval Academy, and generously, the executive director, Lisa Fagan Davis, was sort of like, yeah, go for it, put this together. And so here I am today to talk about what we can offer and how some tips of applying and what sort of different grants we offer. And so a couple caveats before I sort of dive into this is there's an ad hoc committee currently working on the grant process. So they're making some changes to how this is going to work in the future. So make sure you double check the website before applying because things are going to change. Some things might not change, some things might change. So just double check before you go to apply. Also, in case you're wondering, I don't have any direct role in adjudicating grant applications, so I can't speak to sort of what they discuss behind closed doors. I can't sort of give you any, insider information about that. But what I can talk about is the grants and what we offer. So, in case you're unfamiliar, which would be a little bit strange if you're here, but maybe for the YouTube restream later, if you're unfamiliar with the Medieval Academy, what we do, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview. So, the Medieval Academy was founded in 1925 and it's located in Boston, Massachusetts. It's one of the largest organizations in the US promoting medieval studies, but it's not just for the United States, it encompasses sort of all of North America and also publishes the journal Speculum, which you have probably heard of. Now, I've put the website here, medievalacademy.org, and you can go there to find sort of more comprehensive information about the grants and the Medieval Academy. I'm sort of giving an overview here because no one wants to listen to an hour-long presentation about grant material. That's not what I'm trying to do. However, if you are interested in sort of a guide that I put together for grants, you can see where it is on the website. If you hover over the grants tab and scroll down, you'll see a guideline students, which will take you to a PDF that I wrote that sort of summarizes a lot of the information here, but in written form instead of as a presentation. And so, how are grants awarded by the Medieval Academy? One thing you have to keep in mind is you have to be a member to apply, which I'm sure all of you are. And so for students, a yearly membership is $30, so not too bad. And each grant is covered by a specific committee and who make their decisions based on criteria listed for each grant. So that's sort of who is adjudicating these applications that you send in. It's not sort of the executive director or someone in the Boston office. It's usually a sort of committee dedicated to that specific prize. And in general, there's a couple good criteria that you want to keep in mind for each grant. One is the cogency of the writing of your application. and the materials, right? So if you're writing a letter of proposal or whatever, how coherent is that? How organized is it? How well written is it? The necessity of the grant to your research, right? So why do you actually need the grant? Always worth keeping in mind when you're trying to apply for funding, and the value of the project to the field. So sort of the scholarly value of your project and why this grant helps you sort of contribute to the wider field. And then there are some general tips that I can give you for writing grant applications, especially from what I've seen. And so you want to tailor your materials and proposals to really address the latter two criteria, right? So you really want to make sure that you're expressly talking about the necessity of the grant and the scholarly value. Another really important general tip is to plan in advance, especially for some of these bigger grants. You want to maybe think about them a year or maybe even more, depending on what they are, before you apply. And that's not just for getting all your application materials together, it's also for thinking about when you need the funds, right? If I need the funds for a research trip next summer, then it sort of changes when you're going to apply and what grants you can apply for. So make sure you're thinking about when do you actually need these funds? When do you want to apply? When are you in a position where you're going to be able to go and spend, time at an archive? And it also lets you line up your letters of recommendations, which are not all necessary. Not all the grants need them. Some still do. But if you planning in advance, it gives you more time to make sure that you have that lined up. And so, before, one last sort of caveat: when you're applying, make sure to double check all the requirements. Don't send an application that's missing something because you're trying to do it at the last minute and you forget something. So make sure you're checking all the requirements so you're submitting the best possible application. And so we have a sort of we have a whole wide variety of grants at the Medieval Academy, and I've listed them by type here. Some grants are only for certain things, such as the dissertation awards, but others kind of fall into multiple categories. So this isn't a sort of exhaustive list. If you go to the actual website, you'll see them individually, not by category, because they kind of overlap a little. But broadly, there are sort of four categories that they break down into: travel and conference grants, dissertation grants, research grants, and summer programs, and then one other grant that I will talk about at the end. So another thing to keep in mind is also the dates. So I've also listed all of the grants by date here, and I've collected that information sort of for ease of reference. Each grant on the website will tell you this information, and the dates in parentheses are the dates by which you need to be a member to apply. So some things, such as the Shalleck Awards, they have a deadline of February 15th for their actual grant, but you have to be a member of the Medieval Academy by January 15th to apply. So just keep that in mind. Some depend on being accepted to the annual meeting, so those are a little bit odd too. So the annual meeting bursaries, so those you can only apply for once you've actually been accepted to the annual conference. So these are just sort of things to keep in mind when you're applying for these. And if there's one there that says November 2027, the Burgett Baldwin Fellowship, that can be renewed for a second year, so it's only solicited every 2 years. So the next time that is going to be sort of you can apply for it is next year, not this year. And so now I'm just going to go through these kind of briefly, just to give you a sense of sort of what they're covering, what sort of opportunities are available, and sort of how you can apply for them. So the first category are the travel and conference grants, which are pretty self-explanatory about what they are. So the first one is the annual meeting bursary, which is pretty self-explanatory. If you're accepted to present at the annual meeting, you can apply for this $500 bursary. The program committee judges this based on the abstract you submit to the conference. And when applying, you can also apply for the best student paper, but you need to submit the whole paper no later than 2 weeks before the conference. So make sure when you're thinking about applying for the best student paper, you have the paper written. I was notoriously bad at this, but maybe some of you are much more enterprising than I am. Then we have the Inclusivity and Diversity Travel Grant, which is pretty much the same as the bursary, but for presenting on diversity and inclusivity in the Middle Ages. So this is something that might be a non-European topic or gender, race, class, right? So sort of something a little bit different and fits that sort of theme. And you're going to apply here. This has a little bit more requirement for what you're going to apply with. So you're going to apply with a CV, a biographical sort of abstract, the abstract to your presentation, and the completed presentation yourself. So this one you actually do need to have it before you sort of apply. And then some of these I have been able to compile the acceptance rates. So in 2025, this had a 50% successful application rate. So 50% of people who applied for this got the grant in 2025. Next, we have the Bell DaCosta Green Award, which was named after Bell DaCosta Green, who was a prominent art historian and the first manuscript librarian of the Pierpont Morgan collection. She was also the first person of color and the second woman to be elected a Fellow of the Medieval Academy in 1939. And this is a $2,000 award for research and travel expenses. It's pretty open-ended for whatever you want to use it for. And if you're using resources at the British Library, there's another thing called the American Trust for British Library Funding, which is sort of a supplementary pool that you can try to apply for as well, which is another $2,000. And for this, you're applying with a CV, a proposal, budget, and optionally two references. And in 2025, this had about a 9% successful acceptance rate. Then we have the Fellows Research Award, which was funded by Fellows donations for PhD candidates and non-tenure track scholars to sort of help support their research. And this is two $5,000 awards for travel and access expenses to consult manuscripts, archives, etc. And like the previous one, also eligible for the British Trust supplementary funding. And in your proposal information here, you want to sort of emphasize why the funding is needed to consult original sources and the project's rationale and its contribution to the field. So most of these are going to have very similar kind of requirements and things they're wanting you to talk about in the application. But this one, again, right, you want to sort of explain why you need the original sources here. Previously, this was meant for those without institutional funding, but this has been changed. So if you have institutional funding, you can still apply for one of these. Finally, we have the Layerly Cara Prize, which was in honor of John Layerly, who contributed to the Committee on Centers and Regional Associations, which is known as CARA. And this one is specifically $1,000 to support research in Toronto-based collections. So this is if you need something, at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, the University of Toronto. This is something where you are really going to go to those collections specifically, and you can apply for this pot of money. This one is a little bit different than the other ones in that it's administered by Toronto mainly. So you're going to send your applications by email to them, and all the information is listed on the actual grant page on the Medieval Academy website. But this one, the Medieval Academy, does not sort of have as strong of a role overseeing. So make sure you keep that in mind and you're sending it to Toronto, not to us. Obviously, you want to emphasize why Toronto is important and necessary to your project. Then moving on into the next category, we have dissertation grants. And so the first one is the Shallick Fellowship, which was one of the sort of two biggest ones that we offer for graduate students. This was funded by a gift to the Richard III Society, the American branch, from William B. and Mary Lou Spooner Shallick. The grant's administered by the Medieval Academy on the Richard III Society's behalf, and this is a $40,000 grant to fellowship to defray expenses for the equivalent of one academic year. And it's open to those working specifically on late medieval Britain, 1350 to 1500, or to those working on British connections to the European continent. So there's some wiggle room depending on what your topic is, but sort of a broadly British-based late medieval project. And so you can also apply for the British Trust supplementary funding. But one thing to keep in mind for this grant, because of the size and the scope of the grant, right, this is going to require a bit more application material. It requires 2 letters of recommendation. And, right, this is one that you really want to be planning for quite well in advance because of how big it is and how much you're going to need to sort of explain why you need this whole year to work on your dissertation. So make sure you give your writers a heads up for the letter. One element the proposal is evaluated on is regarding the excellence of the project and the applicant's preparation. So this is something you want to sort of let your letter writers know. Make sure that they emphasize this as 2 parts that they want to see in the letters. And in 2025, this had a 13% successful acceptance rate, but do keep in mind that this only was awarded to 1 applicant. So then we have sort of the other big dissertation fellowship, which is the Bridget Baldwin Fellowship, which was endowed by a gift from John Baldwin and Jenny Jawkins in memory of their daughter. And so this is a $20,000 grant to a student writing a dissertation on French medieval history that requires sustained research in archives and libraries in France. So like the previous one, it defrays expenses for the equivalent of 1 academic year, and it can be renewed for a second year. So that is why it only is solicited every 2 years, because it can be renewed for a second year. And like the other one, you will sort of want to explain why this dissertation requires you to study in France here. So you want to make sure that you're emphasizing why you need to travel to an archive, what kind of archive you're looking at, sort of give the reason why you actually need this money. And like the Shalak Fellowship, you want to make sure you indicate to your letter writers what they're looking for in the letters. And so there's a lot more detail that I could go into here, but you want to go to the website because it'll have a more comprehensive list of everything involved. I'm just sort of giving the broad overview here. Then we have a series of smaller dissertation grants. And these are sort of all named after different people. To commemorate the MAA's 75th anniversary, the Academy established 5 grants that were named in honor of members who contributed to the development of the Academy. Since then, an additional 4 grants have been funded, so there are currently 9 of them. And these are $2,000 grants for students writing on medieval topics. They're meant to defray research expenses, so maybe cost of travel to research collections or costs of photographs, things like that. However, books and equipment are not eligible. So there are some restrictions on what you can use this money for, but they're relatively open in terms of helping you conduct your research. If you do late medieval Britain, then there's a different one that's called the Shallick Award, not the Shallick Fellowship, but I will get to that in a minute. And that's what you should be applying for. Like above, the evaluation is based on letter writers, but also the originality of the dissertation project and the need for the grant. And in 2025, this had a 40% successful acceptance rate. And then we're going to turn now to the research grants. Some of these I've already covered, such as the Bell to Cross the Green Award, the Fellows Research Award. Those were sort of already included. I've already talked about them, but those can also sort of be categorized as research grant, depending on what you're looking for. So the one thing is the Shallick Award, which is not to be confused with the bigger fellowship, is a separate thing. These are $5,000 grants to help with research costs, and they're sort of similar to the MA dissertation grants, but they have a sort of bigger remit. You can sort of apply to them at different ways. And it's restricted to students writing on late medieval Britain or British connection to the European continent. So like the Shallick Fellowship, it's sort of restricted to a sort of subset of the graduate student population. And in 2025, this had a very high acceptance rate of 83%. So if you're working on that sort of subfield or something that deals with that topic, right, this is a pretty good one to apply for. Then we have the Inclusivity and Diversity Research Grant, which is $3,000 to a scholar at any stage of their career who seeks to pursue innovative research that broadens the scope of medieval studies, and it prioritizes those who are students, or right, so if you're a grad student, early career or non-tenured scholars. So that's sort of the prioritization there. So if you're a grad student, this is something you can also apply for. And this includes projects that focus on non-European topics or topics that fall under the Inclusivity and Diversity Committee. So that could be race, class, gender, sexuality in the Middle Ages, something like that. And also, like some of the other ones, you can apply for the British supplementary funding if you needed. And in 2025, this had about a 33% acceptance rate of successful applications. Now, those are sort of the main sort of research and travel and dissertation grants. There's a couple other programs that we have and a couple other grants. And so the first one is the summer programs. These are sort of meant to help you either build your skill set or become more relevant to the field or help you grow as a scholar. And so the first one is the CARA Summer Program and Tuition Scholarship. And this helps participation in summer courses in medieval languages or manuscript studies. There's generally about 4 to 8 awards each year, typically not more than $1,000 each. And it's important to indicate in your sort of application material why the summer course is important and how it fits into what's already available. So if you have something that you really need to take because your dissertation really depends on a certain language, but your home institution doesn't offer that, right? This is the sort of thing you want to be emphasizing in your application. There's a list of programs that are on the Medieval Academy website. I don't believe it's meant to be comprehensive. So if there's something that you're finding that you're thinking this might be relevant, you can always send us an email and we can sort of talk about whether it is or not. We'll tell you. And in 2025, this had a 33% successful acceptance rate. Then the other summer program is the MAA Summer Research and Professional Development Workshop, which comes with a $1,500 stipend and 1 year of membership to the Medieval Academy. And this is designed to make you more successful and competitive for grants and academic positions through growing skills. So it's a series of workshops that are virtual that take place over 6 to 8 sessions in the summer, obviously, given the name. And preference is given to applicants with more limited access to similar resources. So, if you don't have something at your home institution that might do this for you, right, this is something you want to mention. It's not necessarily, if you do have something, it's not necessarily going to be determinative, but preference is given to people that sort of don't have access to this type of resource. And then lastly, we have sort of one sort of grant that doesn't fit in with the other categories. And this is the Medieval Academy and Graduate Student Committee Grant for Innovation and Community Building and Professionalization. So this is a $2,000 grant to an individual or a group to help create new and innovative efforts to build communities of graduate student medievalists. Usually only one grant can be divided. Usually there's only one grant, but this can be divided at the committee discretion for multiple projects, so maybe $2,000 grants or whatever they want to do. And so this has a good deal of logistical requirements for who can be the primary applicant and the graduate student. So make sure you familiarize yourself before you apply, because whoever the primary person is has to remain a graduate student for so many months. They have to sort of make sure that they're there for the whole time. And one thing to keep in mind for this, right, is this could be something like a graduate student conference or something like that. But when you're thinking about applying for this, don't plan too big a project. Ability to implement it in 12 months, the year, the term of the grant, is part of the evaluation criteria. So try to keep yourself grounded about something you think you can actually accomplish in a year. And so in 2025, this had a 67% acceptance rate, two-thirds. And so those are pretty much all of the grants that we offer for graduate students. If you want to join or renew membership, you can follow the QR code here or go to the Medieval Academy website. I hope this was helpful, and we really want to support graduate students. We really recommend you apply for these grants. Part of this is to sort of demystify this process, make it sort of not as intimidating, perhaps. And so, yeah, I think now we have plenty of time for questions, if people have questions, and I'm happy to answer whatever I can.
Thank you so much, John, for that overview. This is a webinar format, so if you could put your questions in the chat, I will moderate the questions for John here. So while someone is thinking of their first question, John, do you happen to have any kind of timeline on the changes that will be coming to the grants?
Yeah, I don't know exactly when they're going to be changing, but it should be probably sometime in the fall. The committee is sort of like working through it right now, and then I believe they send their sort of recommendations. It'll go to the council. The council sort of approves it, and then it'll be sometime in the fall that this will happen, I think. I don't know for sure, but when it does, we'll presumably send it out in the graduate student newsletter and the regular newsletter to make sure everybody's sort of aware of it. But for now, everything is what is being presented here. And so yeah, just make sure you double check. That's why it is going to happen at some point, but it sort of depends on the committee.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. We have
Yeah.
some questions in the chat. Um, Polina says, thanks for that. That last GSC one, so believe it's the MAA GSC Innovation Award. Does it have a deadline to submit or is it open all year?
Um, yes, it should have a deadline. Let me go back to my slide here. Did I not put it on here? Oh, yes, it's February 15th. February 15th is the
Thank you.
deadline for it.
As someone
Yes.
who used to adjudicate that award, I couldn't remember either. So
Yes.
I'm glad you had it. Okay, we have another one. Does the summer manuscript/language course fellowship cover online courses such as the ones offered by the Mediterranean seminar?
Yeah, I don't think it's I want to say that it does cover the virtual ones. If you go to the MAA website and go to that sort of eligible programs, it might already be on there, in which case, great. If not, you can send us an email and then, you know, we can refer it to the committee and see, I think is probably how that would work. Because I don't make that sort of decision myself. I'm just sort of the messenger. But yeah, I don't think I don't, it's not a sort of in-person requirement as far as I'm aware.
Okay. Next question. If you've already received a Kara Summer Award, will you be given lower preference for other awards?
For other, so this is also one of those things that is probably up to the committee. And the committee might prioritize people who have not received a grant, but there's sort of nothing that I know of that sort of makes that guaranteed, right? Like if you've already gotten a grant, there are some where the travel grants for not for the graduate students, but for the sort of, there's a generic MAA travel grant. That one does have a specific prohibition that you can't get it if you've already gotten it within 3 years or something. But these, I don't believe, have that sort of restriction. It might be something the committee takes in mind, based on how many applications they get and sort of what they're trying to do with the funding. So they might say, oh, yeah, we want to try to spread this out to people who have not gotten the funding previously. Or it might be a year where there's plenty of, there's not a ton of applications, or there's enough applications that they can say we can fund people that have already gotten some money before. So I think it would sort of depend on the committee itself. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule for it.
Okay, yeah, and I would add to that too. The other awards, I mean, they can be
Yeah,
quite different in their requirements and who's actually giving them. So like the
yeah.
Shallock, because it's, kind of removed from the MAA, I would imagine that if you got a Kara Summer award, it wouldn't have any bearing on.
Yeah, I think it would only matter if you've already gotten the same award. More
Yeah,
like if you're going for something completely different. One, it's probably going to be a completely different committee, and they might not even they might
yeah,
not even know that you had that other award. So I don't think it's a problem.
yeah. Okay, thanks. Next question. Can you apply to or receive multiple awards in the same cycle?
That's a good question. I would have to actually sort of see if there's a specific rule about that. I don't actually know off the top of my head. Um, I'm just trying to think of a scenario where you would necessarily be applying to multiple of these in a way that they would sort of overlap. I think normally they're sort of distinct sort of pots of money, like in terms of what you would be doing as a project. Like because it's like for a specific like research trip. Like you get a $2,000 grant to go to a specific archive. So I don't know if you necessarily would be applying to like multiple of these at the same time for the same trip. If that makes sense. But that's a good question that I will follow up with because I think it is a useful thing to have written down somewhere about whether there's a rule for this, and there could be. Um,
Okay. While we're waiting to see if there's any more questions coming up in the chat, I will ask one that I was talking to someone about recently. This person has just graduated and they're wondering what kind of funding, if any, is available through the MAA for just graduated students, so early career.
yeah, so there are specifically early career grants. So if you go back to the website here, um, to under the grants and awards tab, right, there's a specific section that's for junior scholars, and that'll have grants for that. If you are an independent scholar or an adjunct or something, there's a sort of subset for those too. So depending on what your status is, and so there are guidelines for the sort of independent scholars that I wrote as well when I was doing the students one. So you'll see there's actually two guidelines, one for students, one for non-students. The non-students one is geared more towards sort of independent scholars, early career people. So if you're sort of in that sort of transitional point where you've sort of graduated, but you're not a sort of full-time tenure faculty, right? Those do exist, and there are quite a few grants for people that are in that scenario. Some of them overlap with the graduate student ones, not all of them. But you can go there and you can find the more specific information.
Okay, thanks. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but I was going to ask you one more thing just because I think we went over it quite quickly that glues on to so many of the awards. Can you talk a little bit about the American British Library grant that you can tack on to so many of the applications?
Yeah, so this is basically just a sort of you don't sort of need to do anything else for it. It's mostly if you are going to be using the British Library. So say you're traveling to London, or the UK, and you're doing some research there in an archive, but you also have something that's in the British Library that you're going to use, some of the resources there. This is sort of a supplementary grant. It's not part of the sort of original grant application that is sort of handled a little differently. You can just sort of like check a box when you do your application, and then you're sort of entered into the sort of proposal process for that. And then you might get that, you might get not as part of the application. And so it's not a sort of part of the grant. So if you're not doing anything with the British Library, it sort of doesn't matter at all. If you are, it would be something sort of like added on top of the grant. So it's like an extra $2,000.
Mhm. Yeah, and my understanding is that you kind of just check a
Yeah.
box
Yeah. Yeah.
if you're
There's no
applying.
extra, there's
Yeah.
no like extra application process if you're doing it. I mean, presumably, right, you would mention it in your proposal material of like why you need it,
Yeah.
but there's not a sort of like separate application for it. And that is one thing, I did see there's a Q&A question here
Yeah,
about
I just saw that too.
proposing the same project to multiple grants if it's sort of relevant. One thing, some of them do specify that you don't need to sort of tailor the application. Some of them you can actually use material that you've already written for maybe another grant or something and just sort of submit that. It's not all of them, so it's why it's worth keeping in mind. So some of them, the barrier is supposed to be low. If it's relevant to multiple things, right? So in this case, the dissertation grant and the IND grant, there's nothing that says you can't propose the same project to them. And this is again a sort of committee level thing that I'm not privy to, is sort of how much interaction there is between them, where you could get both, you might get one, they might talk to each other and say, can we move it into one or the other? Does it fit more? So I would say, there's nothing to stop you from sending it to both and applying for both and seeing which one you get, because it might fit better for one or the other, right? Based on the committee and what your project is.
Great. And then another one came through in the chat. Um, what kinds of details should the budget typically include?
Yeah, so this is not meant to be a like hyper specific budget, right? But you want to give an idea of how you're going to use the money, right? So give an idea of, oh, the flight is going to cost roughly this much. The accommodations are going to cost roughly this much. You know, maybe there's some sort of fee that you have to pay, or right? So you want to give a sort of sense to the committee that you have thought about this, you've sort of planned out this trip. And so you're going to need this money for like a very specific reason. So you don't necessarily need to have it like, I'm going to take this exact flight that costs like, down to the penny. But you want to sort of give a sort of rough idea of like, I have thought about this trip. This is the kind of money that I need. I might need $2,000, or, this $2,000 is going to cover me, halfway there. And then the other $2,000 might come from somewhere else, or, so you don't have to give it sort of exactly, but you want to sort of give some thought to the kind of problems you might encounter, right? Like, not just saying like, oh, it only costs me, $100 if I take this really cheap flight, right? Like, but sort of showing to the committee you've thought about like how much are you going to spend for food, how much are you going to spend on transportation once you get there, right? Maybe you have to take trains around to different archives, or accommodation, or the flights themselves, right? You've sort of thought about the sort of logistics of the project, and that's sort of what the budget is doing.
Great. Thank you. It looks like we don't have any more questions coming in through the chat or the Q&A. Do you mind going to your last slide where your email is posted?
Yes.
And we've got one more question that just slid in. Does it matter whether both of your referees are medievalists? What might be this person's supervisor, but the other might be pre-modern. Oh,
No, I that shouldn't matter as long as like right the point of the letters for the most part, right, is to show that you are capable of handling this work. So that's what you want the letter writers to really emphasize, right? Because if you're applying to say like I want this money to go to an archive in Germany, right? You want your letter writers to really say like, okay, he has the paleography, or she has the Latin skills, or the German skills to handle this type of work in an archive. And so the letter writers don't necessarily need to be medievalists in that sense. It doesn't hurt, right? That obviously helps because they can speak more emphatically to why this project is useful to the field. But that doesn't, I don't think there's a requirement for it. No.
okay. Last chance for questions from the audience.
I see one thing in the Q&A about the slides. So the slides are kind of replicated by the guide that you can find on the Medieval Academy website that I wrote. That if you go to let's see, if you go to the homepage and then hover over grants and awards and find guideline students, it'll open up a PDF that is pretty much what I've written here. So it sort of replicates the slides in a sort of written form that's not a PowerPoint. So that's probably a better thing to look at.
And this will also be posted to YouTube.
Yeah.
So if you need to revisit the slides in that way too, or this whole spiel, then go ahead and do that. it'll end up on YouTube pretty soon here. So, okay. And if you have any more questions, John is so generous and willing to field your emails, questions. He's pulling up his email right now. Here
Yes.
we go. jdelizola at themedievalacademy.org. So
Yes. Yeah, if you have questions, you can always send me an email. I'm like really happy to talk to graduate students about what we offer. If I can't answer your question directly, I can presumably get you to the right place. I'll direct you on to wherever is most beneficial for you. If it's not something I can answer, but yeah, just I'm really like I was a graduate student until not too long ago, and I know what it's like, and it's not easy. So I feel really strongly about like helping people apply for this money and get the money that they have access to. So yeah, so feel free to reach out to me if you have questions.
thank you so much, John, for being willing to
Yeah.
help bridge the rest of it for us. So grateful. And we have thanks in the chat too. So thank you, thank you. And thank you, Chris Cole, for making sure all of our technology goes smoothly. Again, this will be online shortly. Thank you, everyone who came, and look out for us at Kalamazoo. Thank you.